Can I welcome everybody to today's Oversight Committee meeting, where we're very fortunate to have the Government Minister for London joining us as our main item of discussion and some questions. Can I also welcome members of the public who are watching on the webcast. I've called this meeting under the urgent basis for the reasons set out on the agenda, which is on the website. In accordance with government regulations, we're holding this meeting on a virtual basis. Assembly members and the guests participating remotely. I'm joined here by a small team here in City Hall, both by a senior advisor and a small technical team to enable this meeting to happen. I will call Assembly members to speak by name during the question and answer session, and I will also introduce our guests when we get to that item of business. We have one or two formal items to deal with before we reach that main item. But I can please remind participants to turn off their phones and to put them on silence. And can I ask the clerk to confirm the names of Assembly members who are virtually present at this meeting and any apologies for absence?
Thank you, Chair. We haven't received any apologies for absence for this meeting. The members who are currently present on the call for the broadcast are Assembly Member Deval, the Chair, Deputy Chairman Assembly Member Hall, Assembly Member Berry, Assembly Member Boff, Assembly Member Desai, Assembly Member McCartney, Assembly Member Pigeon, Assembly Member Prince, Assembly Member Sahota, Assembly Member Shaw will be joining shortly, Assembly Member Whittle, and observers on the committee today are Assembly Member Cooper and Assembly Member Dismore.
Thank you for that. Can I move to item 2, declarations of interest? Can we note the list of offices held by the Assembly members? Is that agreed? I take nods as agreement. Can I also ask members if there are any disclosure called pecuniary interest in specific items listed on the agenda?
Nope.
No. Then can I turn to item 3 on the agenda, that brings us to our main item, which is the London response to COVID-19. We're very fortunate to have joining us today Paul Scully MP, Minister for London, but also in his main job as Parliamentary Under Secretary of State, Minister for Small Businesses, Consumers and Labour Markets. And Minister, we know that you've had a busy time, just getting to us at this moment with parliamentary business. But can I say thank you? It's not often that we have a government minister before us, and we know there are all sorts of rules that govern you in Parliament, as well as in your ministerial duties. So we're very grateful that you've taken this decision to come and answer some of our questions. If I may, do you want to say just a few words first before we launch into our questions? Or
yeah, that'd be great. Can I just thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having me on. It's really good to have the opportunity to discuss the issues with you, answer any questions you've got, and to hear from you, because that's really what I see the Minister for London job as, is this liaison really between government, the GLA, the Mayor of London, and London councils and other stakeholders as well, bringing them in so we can recognise that the contribution the government makes financially and other support resources towards TfL, the Mayor, that we can make sure that that's used well, but also to see what more I can do to get government to work for the GLA and for the Mayor of London and for all of the other parts of it as well. It fits in really well with, at this moment in time, especially with my substantive role in Bays, in supporting small businesses and labour markets, workers' rights, and working with the Business Bank to give those loans, because that is the fundamental issue of our time, and it's really important that we remain flexible in our support, that we listen to both yourselves that are on the there in the front line, also our emergency services, but business as well, of all of the different sectors. London is affected in particular ways, which I'm sure we will discuss in the next hour. But thank you very much for the opportunity.
No, thank you. So let me begin. In your role, Well, explain a little bit more about your role as Minister for London, and particularly during the emergency that we're facing at the moment. How do you work with the Mayor, and along with that, how do you both advocate for London's interests during this emergency?
Well, look, the Mayor for London is the elected representative, the elected strategic leader of the city. The government has clearly devolved a number of powers to him, and it's important that he has his voice. I will work with him to make sure that government can support him in that endeavour. It's important as well, though, that I sort of lead the way, I suppose, in holding him to account for the support the government gives. So it's a two-way process, and therefore I will speak to him, work with him on transport issues, on business issues, and making the most of what we can get from working with local authorities as well. 32 boroughs, 32 different stories, 32 different sets of local contexts. It's really important that we work together on.
Okay, and in that sense, over the last sort of 9 weeks, in terms of the main concerns of the London Strategic Coordination
Okay, I've
Group,
got it. Yeah.
in terms of those, sorry, we had a slight interruption. What are the main concerns that you've had from the London Strategic Coordination Group that you've been able to relay back into government over the last 8 to 9 weeks? And, you know, can you tell us a little bit more about your interactions with that strategic coordination group overseeing London's response to the emergency?
Yeah, so one of the early, the time that I met the Mayor, because I was keen to try and speak to the Mayor as quickly as I could when things were starting to get restricted within London. And we all saw, and I'm sure you were commenting as a group, about the congestion on the tube. As things were starting to be restricted. So I was keen to find out from the Mayor firsthand what was going on the tube, on the buses, on the roads, and we had a conversation at that point some weeks ago. Since then, with the strategic group, I've been on pretty well a daily call with John Barradell, who's been doing an amazing job in terms of the very much the technical detail, whether it's about NHS capacity, transport capacity, and the response to businesses. And so my response to government has to be making sure that we can keep the channels open to really what John Barradell in particular was asking for. And that was very much just making sure that we could get all the government departments working, Department of Transport, the Department of Health, and CLG, to get money to businesses through CLG and Bays, to get the Nightingale Hospital obviously up and running, and all of the support around the health piece as well. But importantly, making sure that the transport system could work for key workers, but also the other people that we were saying go to work if you really couldn't work from home, to keep the London economy going. And that was the sort of piece that I was liaising between that strategic group, the resilience group, and government departments.
Well, thank you for that. And I suppose my final question, I don't want to dwell too much on the last 9 weeks. I think some things worked well, some things have not worked well, some things could be better. But one of the issues around the dealing with the emergency is about messaging and the issue of mixed messaging. We're now going into another phase. In terms of that, what can the government do to be much more clearer about its messaging? And I say that against the background of almost, there is a ridicule of some of the messaging coming out from government at the moment, which is not helping dealing with the most serious emergency we've ever had to face since the Second World War in total nationally. So what do you think we can do, and what do you think we could expect from that? No doubt you've been talking to your colleagues inside government about that.
Yeah, look, I think this is a two-way street. I think you're absolutely right about messaging. Messaging is absolutely crucial, and it's really at the heart of this, because what we have done in the first phase was talking about staying at home, protecting the NHS, saving lives. And clearly, saving lives remains the government's #1 priority, but restoring livelihoods, protecting businesses has got to be right up there. So make sure that the London economy can come back from this and start to bounce back when appropriate, when devices right. And we can't afford mixed messages. It was a shame that we got into, and I don't want to dwell on it, but we got into a little bit of politics originally when there was the mixed messages about who was using the public transport system at the back. Was it reserved for key workers? Was it not? Well, clearly, as I said, there were a lot of businesses that weren't told to close down, and if they really couldn't work from home, they should have been working. They could use public transport, but it was right to say that they needed to be able to stagger their journeys. Think, do they really need to be going at particular times of the day, rather than leaving that for the key workers, the NHS workers that really had no choice, they had to be on call. And we're now at the point when, as you say, that messaging is getting a little bit lost, but we've talked about staying alert. And actually, what that's doing, that's giving notice. It's giving notice to London. It's giving notice to London businesses who have asked me for that notice specifically. You can't just, there is no light switch moment when you actually flick up the switch and the economy goes back to how it was. Non-essential retail and definitely the hospitality sector and schools, as we know, need time to ramp up. So just by changing the message, softening it slightly to say, you know what, it's not about staying at home, saving lives now. You clearly need to stay at home if you can't go to wherever possible, but start thinking about the next stage. And that's where the stay alert came from. But the detail that we've added with the safer workplace guidance, with the further guidance, the 50 pages that the Prime Minister outlined, and you'll find the same with the return to school guidance that will be coming out and the working plans, that will start to firm up. But it's gradually working up into a clearer picture as we get to the point when people will be leaving their homes again, and they need to know that they will be able to do so safely. They have the confidence of doing so safely so that they can get back to the new normal.
Okay. Assembly Member Hall.
Hello, Minister. Thank you very much for coming. We do know how busy you are. I know you're putting bills through Parliament at the moment. You said just now that you phone into the London Strategic Coordination Group every day. Is that when everybody else is there? Do you join in when other people are there?
Yes, so we have a London update meeting, which is typically with representative number 10, with John Barradell, clearly representatives from the Metropolitan Police. Chris Dick was there yesterday. The mayor will pop in a couple of times. I think he's been there 2 or 3 times over the last few weeks. But essentially, it's every day. But there are representatives from the GLA there as well, the mayor's office there, and it's essentially really catching up with what the core resilience group has been doing that day, and we'll feed into whatever we need to do for the following day's actions.
Okay, well, I'm amazed you find time to go every day, but I'm concerned. I mean, I refer to the mayor as the missing mayor because he doesn't seem to be going to much. So you've been there every day, more or less, and he's only been there a couple of days. Is that right?
For the last 3 or 4 weeks, I've been there pretty well every time there's been a meeting, as best I can. I've definitely got an advisor on the line every day, but I think I've missed a couple for one reason or another. But I'll always try and do it because it's my one daily opportunity to really get on top of exactly what's going on at this really important time.
Yes, I mean, this coordination group seems to have been clearly coordinating over London, and it seems to have been doing a good job. Have you been satisfied with the way things have been going as best they can be in this emergency?
Yeah. John Barradell's done a really good job of bringing everyone together on this to, as I say, make sure that the boroughs are working together, or the emergency services is joining the dots really, and that's a key thing that I think John has done. Clearly, I think, as the Mr. Chairman said, that there are things that there is no perfect solution to what is an unprecedented situation that we're having to respond to. But I think London's pulled together really, really well, and there's some great examples of good.
Good. Did you appoint Mr. Barradell, or did the mayor appoint him? Do you know?
I didn't. It wasn't anything to do with me. I came in halfway through the process, really, in many ways. So I'm not sure how John came to be appointed.
Okay. Do you think the mayor is actually working as constructively as he could be with the government, or would you wish it was better?
Well, I think all the communications that we've talked about are really key, because think what we've seen over the last couple of days, a few little bit of unsavoury political spats that, frankly, we could really be doing without at this moment in time. I think it's important that the closer we can be in lockstep together with clear messages that are singing from the same hymn sheet, that's what's going to give Londoners the clarity and the confidence that they need. It's what's going to give businesses the clarity and confidence they need, and school teachers and commuters and workers. It's really important that we work together. Now, clearly, there'll be differences, no doubt about that, but it's important that they just don't get involved in the political mire, the party political stuff.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Chairman.
Can I bring in Nhs Surcharge, and we now talk about some of the issues around lockdown guidance and social distancing measures. Nhs Surcharge.
Thank you, Minister. As we ease the lockdown, test, track and trace is very important. So can you give me an update on whether there are any plans to pilot this application in London, please?
No, thank you very much, Mr. Sota. So we've obviously started piloting the situation, the system in the Isle of Wight, because it's a good geographically defined area, and it's got a population that's sufficient of size that enables us to evaluate the app before it rolls out to the rest of the country. There's a single health trust there as well, which delivers all of the NHS services. So it's a good test bed, if you like. We do want to move it to a national rollout as soon as possible. You may have heard from the Prime Minister earlier on in Prime Minister's questions when he wants to get this up and running. They've recruited 21,000 contact testers in England, and we're confident that contact tracing service is going to have enough capacity to trace all identified contacts of people who have coronavirus. And clearly, as we've said, that will be across the country. But London, as we say, with a relatively dense populated, it is a very densely populated city in European terms, it's key that we absolutely get that right for our capital city to give that confidence that I was talking about earlier.
Yes. Well, of course, the Isle of Wight is quite different from a London-like city because it's much more complex. But the other, of course, thing is that one hears in the news about the concerns of the application that has failed some national standards and also the concerns about privacy. Now, can you reassure the BMA community living in London that their data will be protected and they won't lead to anything like a Windrush-like style crisis again?
Well, I think in terms of the Windrush, I'm not sure how you'd relate it to the Windrush situation, which was, really regrettable, and it's not good that ever happened, and it should have been dealt with clearly earlier over many, many years. But in terms of privacy, it's absolutely vital that we get that right, that we protect people's data. But ultimately, this is here to protect people's lives and give people the confidence. And I have the confidence that we're working well on there and keeping to the timetable to be able to roll it out, not just across London, but across the whole country.
Yes. And of course, Minister, in London, the NHS depends on a lot of BME workers, BME doctors and nurses and healthcare professionals. You know that something like 200 healthcare professionals have died, of which 63% were from the BME community. Of the 30 doctors that have died, 94% were from the BME community. And the majority of these nurses and doctors who died came to this country and they were born outside the United Kingdom. People who work in this country have to pay a health surcharge of £400, but the government's now pushed this up to £624. This is a very odd way of thanking the people who've come to this country, work in the NHS, and who've died as a consequence of it, and we thank them by putting up the health surcharge. What do you think about that?
Well, look, I think first of all, it's really important to pay tribute to the people that work within our NHS of all backgrounds, and clearly over many years we've been welcomed people from across the country to work in our most important, most cherished of those emergency services, and I pay tribute to them, and especially pay tribute to those people who have lost their lives within this pandemic serving people. In terms of the NHS surcharge, again, the Prime Minister reiterated his the fact that he was going to stick to the timetable of increasing the NHS surcharge, which brings in a good amount of money towards funding the NHS. And it's fair, it's equitable that we treat that across the whole population that are affected by this, the people coming in. But nonetheless, the point is we want to have an NHS that actually works for everybody, that is well funded, that actually has the resources that it needs. And I do welcome all of those people working within the health service.
Minister, the money this will raise will be peanuts in terms of the budget of the NHS. This is a very odd way of thanking these people who work in this country. We clap on our doorsteps, but this is a kick in the mouth to them, and I think I'm really surprised that you justify that action.
Well, look, it's not a matter of saying thank you to them or not. It's a single tier equitable thing that we've worked on over many years in terms of people coming into this country, as we welcome them into this country with the skills that we need and we really desire, which is why we're changing the immigration system to be more fair and better controlled, to have a fairer immigration system. So it doesn't matter where you are coming from across the world, you will be welcomed and you will have equal chance, rather than having to necessarily, for someone from Bangladesh, from Canada, from Australia, having to sit there behind the queue of someone from the European Union as we leave the EU. They will have just as fair chance, an equitable chance to succeed within this country and to help us in our emergency services. But nonetheless, we've got to be fair to the UK taxpayer as well, and to say that people are coming in, because we can't differentiate when someone's coming in as to where they're going to be in a few years' time. So we've put in a single tier NHS surcharge, and I think that's the right thing to do to make sure that everybody is paying in an equitable fashion.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Chair.
Assembly Member Joanne McCartney.
Hello, Minister. I want to ask, if I can, about the return of children to early year settings and schools. And obviously, all of us want to get them back to school as soon as possible. But earlier, you said there was no light switch you could turn on to make things better and get people back to work. And it does seem to many people, not only teaching staff and those that work in schools, but also to parents as well, that the date of the 1st of June is like a light switch moment, quite an arbitrary date. I noticed yesterday at the government briefing that Dame Angela McLean, the Deputy Chief Scientific Advisor, seemed to suggest that a contact and tracing app working properly would need to be in place before children went back to school. Is that your understanding?
I missed that briefing, but in terms of whether it's a light switch moment, it goes back to what I was saying earlier. The fact is that we are trying to give notice and give fair notice, and working with schools in the same way that me and Bays, I'm working with the retail sector, the hospitality sector, so that they don't have any surprises, as few surprises as possible. If it was just government handing down a set of guidance or some rules to schools, to business, then I'd agree with you. But actually what we're doing is we're working with unions, we're working with businesses, in my case, educationalists in the case of the other work groups for the Department for Education, to get best practice and to see what's there. Because bear in mind, a number of schools are open at the moment, albeit with very, very reduced numbers. So we can see some of the practices, and it's clearly difficult to socially distance, especially at primary school level. So there are real challenges there that we've got to get right. But that's why we announced it, so that we could work over the coming weeks to get to that point of the 1st of June, so that that all schools can feel confident that they've got the guidance in place, they've got the systems in place, the one-way systems, the class sizes and these kind of things, as best we can, to not only start getting children back into education, which otherwise would affect the most vulnerable, the poorest in our society, if they lose big chunks of their education. But also to help that piece, albeit with the guidance the health guidance, with that piece about getting our economy back up and running again and giving their parents the ability to go back to work.
But is it fair to say that government is actually open, that schools will actually do this very differently depending on the school, about the building and so forth? And can I ask, I was interested that you talked about there's still challenges to overcome. Perhaps you could just tell us a little bit about what those challenges. One of them may be PPE, for example, because as you've mentioned, teachers and early years practitioners will come into very close contact with children, particularly the younger ones.
To be fair, I'm not part of the work stream that's dealing with it on a day-to-day basis, so I don't want to launch into something that's outside my scope and give you wrong information, because there are experts within that field and the educationists, as I say, health professionals that are working with the Department for Education on that. But you're right to say that different schools will have different challenges. Buildings will be different shapes. You'll have older buildings. A more modern building, for example, will have slightly wider corridors. They'll be better configured than, say, an old Victorian style building. So clearly, those things will depend on the school. But we will put through some strict guidance that or some guidance for head teachers to be able to use to give them the confidence that by bringing teachers back in, they've done everything they can to make their teachers safe and to make their to make their pupils safe. In terms of PPE in a wider sense, clearly there are ways that and it works for business as well. If employers want to use PPE, they can source it themselves, and that's the same for the mayor. That's for bus drivers.
Yes, certainly. I don't
transport workers.
There will be questions for PPE later on, so I don't want to get into that at the moment. But can I just ask you, for schools, are you looking at providing PPE for schools and earlier settings?
I'm not aware that we are.
Okay. Thank you.
I can't say that categorically, but I'm not aware that we are.
Okay.
Okay, can I then ask Assembly Member Navin Shah for his contribution?
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, Minister. I've got a couple of questions related to transport, funding agreement and matter arising from that. The first one relates to Freedom Pass and concessionary travel. Can you tell us what is your initial assessment of how suspending concessionary travel, including over 60s Freedom Pass, will impact on some of the poorest and vulnerable Londoners?
Yeah, I think what's happened over the last few days, and this goes back to some of the slightly unnecessary stuff that I think we've seen. We've seen this move into a political football rather than where it should have been, because Transport for London finances, I think we all know, or most of us will accept, have not been in a good place for a number of years, and so it's important to get revenue back up and running as best we can. And so you have a situation, you have a difficult balance to strike within the Freedom Pass that you're talking about, in that the majority of, by some way, I would contend, of people that are using Freedom Passes at peak time are using them to go to work. They're still working, so they're still earning. And so it's important that we actually do look, as we're going back to work, comes back to the safer workplaces and safer travel. Do you need to be travelling at the peak times? And I would expect employers to be as flexible as they can at this point to make sure that if you don't need to be going during the rush hour, don't travel. Stagger the working day. I think that's really important. That's not just for the most vulnerable, but that just makes common sense in terms of keeping London moving across this point in time.
Mr. I don't want to go into political battle at the moment, because surely with regards to the state of TfL's funding, it is very controversial. Mayor takes totally the opposite view of what you have said, but let's not go into that territory at the moment. There is genuine anger and anxiety about the proposals, which are very poorly sort of put across on the whole issue about suspension of concessionary fares. Now, specific to those, can I raise 3 questions? On over 60s Freedom Pass, can you confirm whether what is the actual time limit? Is it 4-week or 6-week suspension? and whether that is likely to be extended.
I couldn't tell you that. I haven't got the full details in front of me of the deal. But what I can say with all of this is, as you say, that this is all of this was part of negotiation, and there's two sides in the negotiation. Government will obviously ask for quite a lot of money here, and the mayor on behalf of TfL agreed to the deal. So this is part of a wider package that you need to look at. But I can't give you the weeks, I'm afraid, in terms of that. The answer to that.
Well, I do truly believe, and so do many stakeholders, that this is very ill-conceived aspect of the so-called negotiations, which a lot of things have been imposed, but again, don't want to get into that controversy. Moving on to free travel for under 18s. I understand from the minister's statement that there will be special arrangements made for children who qualify for free travel to schools. Can you confirm that that is the situation, and have the schools been informed, and how actually this will operate?
So this is, yes, basically is the answer to that. So there will be special arrangements, indeed, as there are for the rest of the country. So effectively, it's bringing it in line with the rest of the country. Whereas people with free school meals and that have access to free travel if that's arranged through their school. If they're within, I believe it's if they're further than 2 miles from their school. The key thing with this is that this area starts to become starts to address the social distancing issues that you have on peak times, because there are more than 50% of bus travel at those times are school children. So clearly, if you go back to how things were, you're suddenly going to be getting to serious trouble very, very quickly in terms of trying to have a sensible policy of social distancing on our public transport network. But there will be protections indeed for those people most affected, most vulnerable.
Minister, can I please kindly get you to write to us about details on both over 60 Freedom Pass as well as free travel for under 18s, confirming what exactly are the time frame, what are the actual arrangements made as such. On the issue about, saying that, well, it is okay, we want to sort of suspend morning peak times to ease congestion. But what is being argued is that this will have a very negative and detrimental impact on those vulnerable people, because there are people attending early morning medical appointments, there are pensioners with jobs in schools, there's voluntary sector workers who provide essential and important charity work, etc. So this is something which does require very, very serious consideration. And to be honest, the whole issue is fraught with difficulties, it's unfair, and this could be thin end of the wedge, that Freedom Pass could disappear. So can there be a rethink and actually withdraw the arrangements that have been there? On my last question, it is with regards to funding as well. Can you tell us when you will publish the full text of agreement between the government and the mayor about what's been knocked together between the two parties?
Yeah, well, look, in terms of your first question about a rethink on the use of the Freedom Pass, this is a deal that essentially is Transport for London that are providing that service. So I would definitely raise it with the mayor. At the end of the day, with that sense, he is the strategic leader of London. He is the boss of TfL, so he's ultimately responsible for that. So it's really important that you do raise that issue with him. My understanding is that the text of the agreement between the government and Transport for London will be published in when parliamentary times allows.
Can you also tell us whether there's been any equality impact assessment made when considering this whole business about withdrawal or suspension of concessionary travel? Because this will impact detrimentally, and I don't believe that any such thing has happened, and I don't believe that is acceptable under any circumstances.
Yeah, look, I reiterate the fact I wasn't part of the negotiation process, but at the end of the day, the Mayor accepted this on behalf of Transport for London, so I would anticipate Transport for London would have looked at the impact before agreeing to it.
Well, yeah, Minister, with respect, I think this is not all done by the Mayor. I think this is a joint agreement. Some of the issues were imposed, and therefore I believe that both the onus is on both government as well as of TfL to explain exactly what the position is and how this unacceptable situation has come about. Thank you.
Well, yeah, thank you. Well, what I'd say is, I believe we're due to publish the paper, the deal in good time when parliamentary time allows. But at the end of the day, this comes back to right the way at the beginning when we were talking about the role of Minister for London, government, and the Mayor for London. The Mayor for London is the elected representative of London, and so with that election comes accountability, comes responsibility, and so I'm sure he will be happy to answer your questions about what impact assessment he did in accepting that deal.
I'm sorry, Minister, but I sense a bit of buck passing here, which is really not fair. Londoners expect better, want better, and certainly this is not the end of the matter, because without any equality impact assessment to impose the suspension of critical freedom passes, etc., is really kicking the teeth for Londoners, for the older people, for BME community, and very, very vulnerable people. Thank you, Chair. That's the end of my question and comments.
Okay, let's move on to Assembly Member Caroline Pigeon.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Minister, for coming before us today. I want to pick up from Assemblymember Shah's questioning, because you said at the start you very much see your role as liaising with London councils and all the other partners in London. You also then have said that you were not part of this negotiation deal between TfL and Department for Transport. But what input did you have? Surely, as Minister, and the importance of that role, you must have had some input into it. And did you, when you had an early sight of it, have conversations with London councils and others? Because after all, London councils fund the Freedom Pass, not TfL.
Yeah. No, this was done directly between Department of Transport Number 10 and TfL and the Mayor for London. So it was done with a relatively small group of people, and so I didn't have sight of it at the time. I mean, effectively, the Minister for London, I want to develop into a more substantive role than it has been over the last few years. But so it meant that I wasn't part of that discussion. Nonetheless, it was clear what feedback I did have into the system, into the process, was really the fact that we were going to need to do this. We were going to need to have the conversation about money, with the loss of fair revenue, which I believe was about 1.6 billion estimated over this particular period of time, and that we would have to be looking at what we can do to put the Transport for London's finances back on track, to make sure that government, to be fair to taxpayers from around the rest of the country who are effectively funding this, were looking at Transport for London, making sure they would get a fair and equitable maximisation of their revenue, notwithstanding the issues that you just talked about and Assembly Member Shah has just talked about. But also that we weren't picking up the tab for previous shortfalls of Transport for London finances as well, which I think was the original ask was for £4 billion, which is clearly well in excess of the £1.6 billion estimated that's lost under this current situation.
Okay, so you weren't part of the negotiations, and hopefully that might develop in the future, but you clearly support these restrictions on things like the Freedom Pass. Do you also support the new conditions, which effectively mean the DfT imposing itself on the Board of Transport for London, in some ways trying to take powers away from the directly elected mayor of our city?
Do I support the Department of Transport having a seat at the board? Yes. Do I believe they're taking powers away? No. I believe that actually it's part of accountability. I think what we've had at the moment, we've had a situation when Transport for London has maxed out its ability to borrow money, so it's relied on the GLA to bail it out over Crossrail. We've seen a situation where there's a lot of 22 different projects that have been stopped over the last few years, which affects all Londoners, including me as a Sutton Member of Parliament. You look at the non-urgent repairs, and so it's really, if we're going to offer wider taxpayer support, it's only right that we have oversight over the repairing of Transport for London's finances to be able to move forward in a sustainable way. That's not to take powers away, but we've got to make sure that the Mayor of London is fully accountable. I know you guys scrutinise him through any number of committees and your plenary sessions, but it's important that if we're putting in extra money, that we have that extra oversight.
Okay, and finally, do you agree that to learn from this pandemic and understand what has worked well, what hasn't worked well, that there should be a public inquiry into the handling of COVID-19? Would you support that?
We're clearly going to have to look into this and see what worked well and what didn't work well. How that is formed, I think will be for us to discuss over the coming time. But I don't want to rush into it. I think the whole point with all of this situation is to make comparisons. We talked about flattening the curve, and we've clearly got to wait for that curve to finish before we can actually make a proper comparison in terms of international responses, whether that's in health response, but also business, transport, schooling, and those kind of things. So, yeah, I would support looking at what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong, what form that takes. I think we'll see in the months to come.
Thank you very much.
I'm now calling on Assembly Member Keith Prince.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, Minister. Minister, different countries have adopted different guidance as to the wearing of face masks in public. The Mayor has asked the government to make face mask wearing compulsory, yet he himself has not issued any of this PPE equipment to the transport workers. I wonder if you could comment on that, please.
Yeah, it's up to I think that it's up to any employer, including the Mayor, including Transport for London, to if they want to require their workers to wear PPE, they can source it themselves. They can supply it themselves. Clearly, there's been a global issue in sourcing PPE, and which is why, as a country, we focused on making sure that the NHS get the first priority within that. But the Mayor can at any time look for and source his own PPE, which as more and more UK companies are turning towards manufacturing PPE, he can certainly look to those examples. But in terms of mandating passengers to wear it or all workers to wear it, I'm not sure that's the way forward. There will be certain workers that are at higher risk that cannot socially distance. There's a difference between face coverings and face masks, which we need to look into as well. I've seen people today. I saw a woman pushing someone in a wheelchair with a face mask around her, with her nose uncovered, which is pretty pointless. And you run the risk of giving a false sense of confidence. So we do need to have a serious discussion about the merits, about whether people are wearing PPE away from their workplace as they're travelling, whether it's health reasons or whether it's confidence reasons, both of which are valid discussions. But in terms of before we can mandate it for that wider use, you have to look at that. You have to look at how you're going to enforce it as well. But in the workplace, I would say it's people that cannot safely social distance, then the guidelines say that you should look at supplying PPE.
Thank you, Minister. You were asked a few questions earlier about the over 60s freedom pass, concessionary travel, the increasing of the GLA charge. Wonder if you can just give a bit of clarity as to whether the government insisted on these things happening, or whether it was a situation that the government asked the Mayor to look at possibly doing these things, because I think it's a very important area here, or grey area, which people don't know exactly who has made the final decision on these issues?
So I think the government essentially looked to Transport for London to get their revenue back up and running and in good order. So that meant looking at things that they hadn't necessarily done before. So in terms of, as I say, you had that's one of the drivers behind the reason that Transport for London agreed to and put in place the changes to the Freedom Pass. I talked about the social distancing for issues that if you hadn't have restricted the use of free travel for under 18s, the government recognised the need to put the congestion charge back in place because of the flow in traffic. But the government at no point asked him to immediately increase the fare, the rate of the congestion charge, and put the other restrictions of the congestion charge in terms of timing and weekend use, which is really going to have a significant effect on the hospitality industry when it comes back on stream. And also in terms of the overall fare increase, the RPI plus 1% in terms of the underground, that was something that was already in the Mayor's business plan. So effectively the government said, we'll put that into action.
That's a good point you made on the last issue, because that was already agreed. But earlier, one of my colleagues mentioned about quality impact assessment. So what you're saying is that the Mayor decided unilaterally to make these changes without having done the quality impact assessment, and there was no pressure on the government for him to do that before having made the quality impact assessment.
Well, at the end of the day, if Transport for London are going to put the changes into place, it's for them to do the impact assessments, I would contend. They are the ones that are strategically leading Transport for London. They're the ones that are putting the measures in place. The power is devolved to them. And so, with that devolution of power, surely comes responsibility, the full responsibility, rather than pointing the finger. What I can't stand any situation is people pointing the finger. It might be good politics, it's terrible leadership, and what London needs is leadership at this particular time.
Yeah. Okay, that's quite clear. Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you.
Okay, I want to bring in Andrew Dismore now, I think, on this issue. I've not missed anybody. Andrew Dismore.
Thank you, Chair. Before I go on to my main question, it's about businesses. Can I just put the record straight about the increase in congestion charge and so forth, because it's per 11H of the agreement, which I have got here somewhere, and that makes it quite clear the government expected the immediate reintroduction of the congestion charge, ULEZ and LEZ, and also required the Mayor, with a matter of urgency, to bring forward proposals to increase the charges and also their scope. So that's what the paragraph 11H of the agreement says that. So that's a matter of record. Could I go on to what I really want to ask you about, though, and that's the measures you expect businesses to have in place before their employees return to work. And in particular, I'd like to focus on health and safety issues, because two aspects. First of all, the Health and Safety Executive, I can see the government have given them more money, which is good because they were underfunded before. But the HSC have made it clear they're not going to go out and do any site inspections of factories or building sites and so forth. Indeed, I asked them to go and look at a building site right at the beginning of all this where social distancing wasn't being maintained, and they just wouldn't do it. And the other aspect in relation to health and safety isn't just the HSE's operations, it's also the council's operations, because local authorities are responsible for health and safety in offices, in shops, in the hospitality trade, and that's not just food safety, it's things like we're talking about around COVID. And bearing in mind that the local authorities are under extreme pressure, how do you think you're going to be able to police the measures that are required to be put in place to ensure health and safety both of workers and of users of these various businesses?
Yeah, so to cover your first point, the government certainly did discuss with Transport for London the need to put the congestion charge back, not only for revenue reasons, but also to enable traffic to flow around London as people start coming back to work. But they asked Transport to London to review the scope of the congestion charge. Now, Senator Dismore, you've been around politics long enough. If you think a review is done by any level of government within a day, then it wasn't already in his back pocket, then you know that's incredible ambition. Normally reviews take days, weeks, months, if not years. So to be able to actually add the detail of extending the hours in the evening and over the weekends, and also withdrawing the discount for new applicants of residents for the discount on transport, I would say is somewhat more than just a review. In terms of how we're going to police this, as you say, the Health and Safety Executive have been given an extra £14 million. One of the conditions on that is to make sure that they actually come up with a plan of how they are going to use that money to make sure that employers are adhering to their the guidance. And so it's important that we work with them. But I have regular meetings with the trade unions. I spoke to the TUC members just about an hour ago, when we continue to see how closely we can work together to give their members and therefore employees, the confidence that they are working in a safe environment. I think that's really key to keep them heavily involved, because they've got people that are well versed in this up and down the country, not just in London. But also, as I say, that guidance, the risk assessments need to be published for the larger employers. When you've got 50 employers, more than 50 employees, it needs to be published on the website. And therefore, employees need to know that they can call people out, that they can call their employers out, not just to the Health and Safety Executive, but also to their local authorities. And it's important that we continue to make sure that employees fully know their rights.
Well, that's helpful. Just on the first point, the exact wording in the agreement is urgently bring forward proposals to widen the scope and level of these charges. That's actually in the agreement. And the point I'd make is these negotiations have been going on for some time, so I don't think anything came out overnight.
Well,
but
I think a proposal is very different from an imposition.
Yeah, but going back to the original point, I'm very pleased that the government is talking to trade unions, because they are considerable expertise, as you say, particularly in factories and building sites and so forth. But the real problem, I think, are these smaller businesses, which are in the large part non-unionised, and the sectors involved are non-unionised or weakly organised, office workers, shop workers and hospitality trade. And the problem isn't just the employees, it's also making sure that the customers of these businesses are properly looked after. So what in particular are you doing to try and make sure that the customers of these places are looked after, bearing in mind that the inspection regime through local authorities is going to be very light, if existing at all, bearing in mind the additional demands on the councils from all these other things that have been going. And bearing in mind they haven't had extra money for this particular role. Yeah,
well, look, I mean, a proposal for changing congestion charge usually results in debate and discussion rather than just an imposition. So I think that was what my takeaway from that. But in terms of what we do, if customers won't come back unless we get this piece right, and so we do need to give them the confidence. That will mean clear guidance. That will mean not mixed messages, so that we're all working together on this. Now, in a London context, that obviously means the Mayor of London, the local authorities and central government. In the UK context, it'll also mean the other devolved administrations as well, because lots of London-based businesses have outlets in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and we want to make sure, as best we can, that we've got one set of guidance, so people know that whichever branch of a shop, for example, they're walking into, they know the rules, they know the guidance, they know the expectations. There is all existing health and safety legislation in place that will be able to be called out. And as I said, it's just important that we know that customers understand what social distancing is, what is there for them. And I think actually they do. We've seen that from the. It's almost the opposite effect that we're going to have for customers. It's actually enticing them out of their homes back into to shops and other businesses, for the reasons I said right at the beginning, that the message has been so effective about staying at home. We also we need to do more of a piece on actually encouraging them to come out responsibly.
Okay.
Now, stay alert, as I say, was one position of just changing the emphasis, but we do need to gradually get to a tighter sense of what that new normal looks like and communicate that to customers.
Yeah, well, thanks for that. I mean, the key takeaway from that for me is absolute, clear, and ambiguous guidelines, which we, I think, have been a bit short of recently. Thanks, Chair.
Minister, we've got 5 more Assembly members. If we can speed up with our questioning, and you could do the same, would you be prepared to take those members?
Absolutely fine.
Thank you very
I'm not
much.
sure the next meeting is, but
Okay, Assembly Member Leonie Cooper.
Thank you very much, Chair. And Minister, thank you very much for coming, not just for your London brief, but your other brief as well, because I would just want to ask you a few more things about the economy of London. Obviously, we have a really large hospitality, retail and cultural sector, and we want them to survive, and the government has brought in a number of measures to help them survive. You were talking about having workplace guidance and making it as firm as possible, but obviously the guidance would probably need to be very different for the hospitality sector, the retail sector and the cultural sector. You know, and I wondered if you could unpack that a bit, and whether you've been talking to the trade bodies, you know, for example, the Musicians Union and such like, who are looking after British Retail Consortium, who are looking at the different sectors. And if you could unpack that a bit. You also said it would be up to the employers, the bodies that employ people, but also want to entice those customers in to provide the PPE that's relevant and correct. Now, that might be the case, but it might also be helpful if we say, well, it all, you know, when you go to the cafe, the table should be like this. You should preferentially be outside. The people serving you should have a plastic apron and be wearing gloves. Please pay by plastic card. I mean, that might be too detailed, but could you unpack that for us a bit? Thank you.
No, it's not that detailed, to be fair. You're absolutely right. So what we've done, the Safer Workplaces guidance that's come out already looks at businesses that are effectively never been asked to close in the first place. So we've started with that process, working with the unions, working with the business representative organisations, including the British Retail Consortium, and some major employers, well, employers of different sizes, actually, small businesses as well as big businesses. Now, you may find there is a business, for example, that has more than one type of workplace. So say, for example, you've got someone that works in people's homes doing kitchens. Maybe they've got an office, they work in people's homes, they might work outside on some things, and they've got a factory or a warehouse. So each of those needs a different set of guidelines. So it's not always about each business, which comes where we come to the problem that actually you can't then come up with a bespoke bit of guidance for every single business, but you have to try and compartmentalize it as best we can. In terms of the hospitality sector, we've got a number of working groups that we're now working through, which is going to do exactly that sort of guidance for the businesses that haven't yet opened, but we are fully expecting to open in hopefully June and then July onwards. But hospitality sector, including the tables and the wiping down and the aprons, that's exactly what we're working on now.
Right, and whether hand sanitizer is going to be available for customers as well as for staff, because I think what we're conscious of, we referred to the issue of, you know, bus drivers have been far more impacted than firefighters, for example. So for us, I think it's about making sure that people who, you know, are waiting on the tables, who have extensive interaction with lots of customers, that they are safe. So that when they return to work, because otherwise they could become effectively super spreaders, and that is not going to entice people back out, as you yourself were just saying, is it? So it will be clear enough for us to know that those, if you like, the new front line in the economy, helping get the economy going, that they are going to be assisted and given that guidance. I'm not expecting every single workplace set of guidance to be decided by government, heaven forfend, but I think having those parameters of what we as customers and we as workers can expect would be really helpful.
The hospitality sector in particular have been asked to say it's almost all or nothing for them for the reasons that you've said. Unless you're using a pizza as a frisbee, it's really difficult to serve someone and be 2 meters away from them. So you've got to get it dead right. And there comes an economic problem when you start cutting down the number of tables as well, whether it's economically viable for them to open. So all of these things have got to be mixed together in giving some guidelines, which is why hospitality is probably the biggest challenge, and that's why we've set a later date for expected opening.
But in terms of the cultural sector, for example, I know a lot of retail outlets, particularly supermarkets, have had one-way systems as well as queuing marked out. I presume that, for example, art galleries and such like, you would also be talking to those kind of institutions. These are the great places that people like to go to. It would be lovely to think that people can get back to the National Portrait Gallery, the National Gallery. Are you in discussions with them? Some of them are quite spacious, large buildings and institutions, to ensure that people can enjoy those cultural benefits that we enjoy because we live in.
I speak to all manner of cultural organisations within the within London, especially organisations like the New West End Company and these people that take in a lot of these. But it's important we get it right, because if you look at, say, hotels, if you've got a hotel on the seaside, then that would open because of the sea. But in London, you're not necessarily going to go to a hotel for its own sake. You need it's because of the museums, because of the theatre, the cinema, the restaurants, etc. So again, that's why we've got to get the whole of the economy in London. Notwithstanding the fact it's complex, but we've got to get that cultural offering right as well. Totally.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you very much.
Can I bring in Assembly Member Whittle?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hello there, Minister. My question really is related to what Assembly Member Cooper has just said. Actually, in fact, you've already thrown some light on it. In your role as Minister for London, quite how strong are your ties with, as it were, the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, for example? I mean, or when it comes to the cultural sector, I'm thinking particularly that the Chief Executive of the Albert Hall recently warned that the hall might actually have to close permanently. And I'm just wondering that looking at it, when you look at our theatres, when you look at the Albert Hall, the Opera House, these places, which are hugely important for tourism too, is there not a sort of long-term aim, a long-term plan for more government support? Because these things are not going to come back in any realistic sort of commercial form, I would have thought, not for a long time.
Yeah, so the Arts Council launched a fund specifically on this basis as well. You're right, Culture, Media and Sport Department will work with them as well. So for me, it's really making sure that all of those conversations, I can't necessarily be having those conversations myself, but it's making sure that the representative organisations and the various groups are talking. But I totally take your point that we've got to look after these cultural icons within London to make sure that they can survive and bounce back and then thrive.
Well, this is the point. I think we're all assuming, with respect, Minister, I think we're all sort of assuming that this is some kind of temporary thing that's happened, which is somehow or other, we're going to have this bounce back. I think that what has happened with the lockdown, particularly in London, because we're talking about London, is that this will lead to permanent change. And this is what worries me. When it comes to these, I'm talking about institutions, of course it's worrying from every angle, but we're talking about cultural institutions. And when you have a situation where places like the Albert Hall or wherever else can only take 30% capacity going on, I'm wondering whether in fact there has to be an entirely different way of thinking about these things in the future. And if I could just, just add one more question to that, so I know we've got little time. I wondered, as well as Minister for London, what you thought of the report that came out last week from Public Health England and Cambridge, which was saying that in fact infections have gone right down to precisely 24 a day in London. I wondered how seriously, and you talk about report and your comments on it, but also it has a bearing, does it not, on everything we're talking about with social distancing and everything. If that is truly the case, that it's virtually at zero, doesn't this mean that, the way forward for London might be different to what we've been assuming?
So in terms of your cultural position, I mean, in some ways it may be simplistic, but in some ways your description of the Albert Hall operating at 30% is just a far larger version of what I was saying about restaurants operating at 30%, because it just becomes economically unviable, it becomes culturally unviable in many ways if you've only got a 30% full hall at some of these bigger events and these kind of things. So it's not desirable, but nonetheless, we are living in odd times, and it comes back to the fact that the hospitality sector is likely to be one of the last ones to come back on stream and back on working through the gears at full speed. There will be some permanent change after all of this, because actually, right across the piece, retail is unlikely to go back to how it was before. It's accelerated the discussion we've had in many years about the situation on our high streets, but we've also got flexible working and digital take-up, the positives that come out of this in terms of accelerating their progress. So there will be significant change, permanent change across the board with this. We'll have to see where we go in terms of the cultural institutions that you're talking about. But just finally, in terms of the study that you're talking about, the Public Health England study, I mean, things are looking promising in London, but what we've got to make sure we've got the 5 tests in London and across the country before we start to open up, and we've got to make sure we get that right, not least the second wave, because if we get a second wave back, economically that's really going to be significant. It's going to be an absolute body blow to businesses that are reliant on what we've done together between government support, people's confidence, and the change in business practices that businesses have had to do across the board.
I see. Thank you for that. But I mean, if you're worrying about that and a supposed second wave, etc., then essentially you're saying, this is going to carry on this position now for maybe 6 months. In which case, these things are just simply going to disappear. These things are going to go.
Well, we need to have the conversation not just with us here, Assembly members, but I want to make sure that I'm speaking, and I regularly do, to cultural institutions, to people that are working across the board in London, but each of those different sectors, to try and understand what support we can give, how we can tailor that support. You'd have seen all of the government support across from right at the beginning. It's changed really significantly until now, at this point, because the economic situation has changed, the needs of the businesses and the cultural organisations have changed as well. So we tried to take in more and more people and support them, but we tried to tailor that support and then gradually taper that off as they start to be able to go through the economic gears again. But I'm open to ideas. I'm not closing anything off, and I'm happy to continue talking.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Assembly Member Sian Berry. Assembly Member Sian Berry.
Apologies. It seemed to think I wanted to copy the microphone button instead of clicking on it. I don't know why. Thank you very much, and thank you, Minister, for coming to see us today. My question is about housing, and I know you're not the Minister for Housing, but you will be a housing champion for London, I hope, in government. You will know that a very high proportion of Londoners rent, and that most renters around the country, the highest number, are in our region. And you also know that the loss of a private tenancy is the leading cause of Londoners making housing applications to local authorities. And our housing committee looked at the crisis that already is in temporary accommodation and local authority resources. So in this context, you must recognise that London could be put at risk by the resumption of possession claims and evictions in the private rented sector. So are you arguing within government for an extension of the pause in eviction proceedings past June?
Well, it's something we're definitely talking about, we're definitely looking at. I mean, it's something, ironically, the bit of legislation that I was just in Parliament earlier on was to do very much a similar thing on a commercial basis for commercial leases and rents. So that, because what happens on a business point of view is that we've paused evictions, but then commercial landlords have moved to the next type of more aggressive rent recovery through statutory demands and then winding up petitions. So we're actually making sure that those can be outlawed for the time being, so that as I say, commercial landlords aren't putting undue pressure on commercial tenants. But we need to clearly look at what happens to personal tenants, and landlord and tenant legislation has been going through and chopping and changing for at least 30 years since I was at university. I remember friends that were doing land management that trying to get that balance right, and we've never really managed to get that balance right because it always shifts one way or another. But I'll certainly make sure that we're having that conversation, that we recognise that. I do recognise that, and I will certainly work with that with my MHCLG colleagues.
That's great. I mean, I think at the beginning of the pause, around about 20,000 possession claims across the country were already approaching the courts. Now, we can't be responsible for throwing thousands of people suddenly onto local authorities at this point, I think. So we'll have to do something about extending that. I want to just go on to the point you made about landlords. It's a very good point about landlords essentially being similar to small businesses, which was something I also wanted to raise, because you can look at, for example, the Sunday Times Rich List that came out at the weekend. You can see there are a lot of people involved in property and property ownership, very well equipped to weather this storm. But many other landlords are actually more like sole traders or small businesses, and they are facing a loss of income at the moment from some of their renters through no fault of their own losing their incomes. So I think I would like you to be also arguing within government for reliefs and support for small landlords like you are for small businesses, and not expecting renters to be able to provide that income back in any short amount of time, if ever. I think it is something where the government ought to be putting grants and similar support in place as they have done for small businesses.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, again, from the business point of view, is the people are raised with me, businesses are raised with me, is the idea of space furlough in the same way you got an income furlough. That's something that's been raised time and time again by various retailers, hospitality groups, and these sort of things. And so that goes into the mix and consideration. With all of the support that we're giving, I think one of the key things, whether it's for business, whether it's for personal, it's got to be dealt with. In reality, it's got to be dealt with in as simple a way as possible, because it's something that we're having to deal with quickly and at scale. This is something that, so when you get anybody that's falling between the cracks, there may be a seemingly simple solution for them, but when you multiply that by 750,000 or 2 million, depending on who's being affected by it, it starts to become really complicated, and it can take months to put in place where people need help now. And so that's why we're making the changes. But no, I get the point that you're making, and as I say, there are a number of small commercial landlords and residential landlords that we need to be working through, and it is getting that balance right, but we'll continue those conversations.
Okay, I hope as Minister for London you'll be sticking up for like our largest tenancy group effectively.
Cool.
Okay, right, then can I move to then Assembly Member Nhs Surcharge?
Thank you, Chair. Just to make sure, can you hear me, yeah?
I can.
Yeah, Minister, thank you again for coming in front of us today. I'm conscious of the time, so there's two specific sets of questions that I want to put to you. How does recent government guidance best support those in low-paid and manual jobs whose rates of deaths, as people like the Resolution Foundation have told us, have been higher compared to the general population and those in white-collar professions?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the guidance has got to help everybody, but you're right in terms of the fact that it's, it would seem there is we're starting to get a greater understanding now about who is being infected by the virus, whether it's people from a BME background, more vulnerable, poorer background, and we heard a study suggesting that a third of deaths were with people with diabetes and these kind of things as well. So we need to make sure that in terms of virus transmission treatment that we can reflect that on that and work on that. But the guidance is such that we can, as I say, it goes right back to what I was saying before. We need to give everybody confidence. We need to make sure that not only are we protecting people's lives, but the poorer people in London, that we are giving them the sense that we can retain their livelihoods, that they will have a job to come back to, because otherwise that will start having health effects as well. That will start hollowing out communities if we get that wrong. So both of these things are really, really important for London, and for that particular group of vulnerable people as well. So the guidance is to give them confidence that they can go back to work if they can't work from home, but they will be working in a COVID-19 secure environment, and that's really important that we do that.
Minister, actually, I may write to you, I probably will, about being, more specific guidance, because I'm conscious of the time. But I really want to ask you, you referred to deaths, BME community deaths. Now, we can go on all afternoon, all evening about the reasons for this, and it's an ongoing debate. I want to ask you specifically, how is the government tackling this issue. Just this morning on the Victoria Derbyshire show, there was an interview with the Board of Deputies of British Jews, a very high number of deaths in the Jewish community, something like 480 in the London area, and Filipino nurses, 45 or around 45 of the nursing deaths have been from the Filipino community. I know Filipino ambassadors got involved. I personally got friends of Filipino origin working in local hospitals. So what I really want to know is what are we specifically doing right now in terms of tackling this particular issue? Much has been talked about it, about the causes, and this debate will go on. It's more about action.
Yeah, it comes back to what I was saying before about the understanding about exactly why this is happening and what is going on there. And we want to make sure that if there is something underlying, if there's an underlying reason that this is going on, we can actually take action. We don't want to lose a single life, frankly, but and it's really terrible that each and every one of those examples is a person with a family. So I get that, but there is we are trying to make sure that we're saving all lives. If there is an underlying reason that the Filipino nurses that you're talking about are losing their life ahead of other nurses, then we need to understand that and we need to put an action in place for that.
Minister, that's all very well, and I don't doubt your concern about this issue, your determination to do something, but really, can you tell Londoners one particular thing that the government is doing right now to tackle the risk to BME communities caused by this crisis? We really do need some specific answers, Minister.
Yeah, it's basically it's essentially understanding why that is. We're talking about the fact that any clinically vulnerable people have been asked to take extra care in terms of social distancing. It's really important that employers understand that as well, and they're putting that into place. But the key thing that government is doing effectively is to understand that the highest issue is where instances is where social contact is highest, and therefore we need to make sure, as I say, that we can put particular measures in place that may not already be there, that should already be there, to make sure that social distancing is adhered to at every moment in time. And that's but it's understanding that risk. That is what we're doing at the moment.
Okay, Minister, thank you for that. Just one last question, Chair, if I may. The government has committed, Minister, to offering permanent leave to remain to migrant NHS workers. But I heard yesterday that the government told the GMB trade union that this only applies to certain occupations like nurses and doctors, but not cleaners and care workers. How can the government justify such second-class treatment? I'm sorry, there's the only way to put this. For these low-paid migrant workers have been crucial in helping London to cope with the current crisis. We had an example of the cleaner on television a few days ago, saying that, look, not everyone can be a doctor, but my contribution to keeping the NHS going is as important as other people. Her visa was running out 2 days later. She was being charged an exorbitant amount. So what can you do to give security to all NHS workers? As Dr. Onkar Sahota said much earlier, it's all very well us clapping on Thursday, and I'll be doing my part, and I know you will be doing, and you mean it, but we really need some concrete action to reassure people down the ladder in the NHS about the sort of issues that are raised.
Yeah, look, I mean, you're right. Yes, I do clap on a Thursday, and I do appreciate every single NHS worker. And not just the NHS, it's the essential workers that are keeping London fed. They're keeping us moving as best as we can. But the NHS are right at the heart of this, and that's every level. The cleaners that are doing those deep cleans that are allowing others to be able to work safely. It's really important that it's this time that we do pull together. In terms of immigration, though, it's a wider piece. We've talked about the fact that we are trying to change the immigration system, not to stop people coming into this country or staying in this country, but to just rebalance it, recalibrate it, so we can better manage it, better control it, but essentially have a fairer system. At the moment, we have a situation when you're allowing because of EU rules, we've had the economic migration of places where they've had youth unemployment very high in places like Greece, Spain, Italy, and whereas you've got people with the skills that we want, with the requirements that we want from other countries, whether it's Bangladesh and Pakistan, whether it's Australia or Canada or America, all of those people are don't necessarily get the same fair crack of the whip, and it's recalibrating that I think is really important moving forward. But that doesn't devalue the work that people are doing at this moment in time across the NHS at every level.
Chair, I'll leave it at this.
Thank you very much. Minister, we're very grateful for you spending your time here. Around the table are all different political parties, and clearly there will be political differences, but also around this table, every one of us want you and the government to succeed in trying to defeat this virus and its impact. Too many lives have already been lost, and we need to minimise it in the future. So the bits that are working well, we need that to continue to go in the coming phases. The bits that are not working well and the bits that need working on, we need you to continue to do that. Now, of course, we can only work better in London with clearer guidance and all those things that you outlined. And we hope the exchange this afternoon from your side gave insight into your position, but hopefully we asked some of the questions that maybe Londoners thought that we should be asking of you. And of course, we'd like to continue the dialogue. So I'm very pleased to hear some of the bits that you've said during the conversation about that you've got a role, about the Minister of London's role. We would like to be engaged with that. And at some time in the future, not in the immediate future, we'll bring you back and we'll talk about that, hopefully in different times. And certainly we're about to embark, and I know you may not share this because on the public inquiry, we're not a public inquiry, and nor do we set ourselves up to be a public inquiry, but we do want to begin the scrutiny of the first wave of the impact of the efforts in London of tackling the virus in the beginning. Not about blame culture, not about pointing fingers, but about learning those lessons that we need to know that we're better prepared in the future, to be honest. So we're going to be starting that probably in June, July, and we would very much like a written input from a Minister of London's point of view. But if you're able to join us for a session, then we'll talk to your office about that. But we certainly want you involved in that because it has been one of where government, GLA and its partners in terms both private sector and public that have been in the front line in trying to minimise the impact of this virus. So thank you very much for your time. You can leave us at any time. We've got a few bits of formal business, but we're grateful for the time that you've spared us this afternoon.
Well, can I just say a massive thank you to you, the constructive questions. It's been really interesting for me, fantastic feedback, and I would be more than happy to continue to engage with you and come back to you at any time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All the best.
Assembly members, we've got a bit more business to do, so let's go to the formal note. Can I ask the committee to note the report as a background to putting questions to the Minister for London, Paul Scully MP, on how London has been coping with the COVID-19 crisis and the subsequent discussion?
Noted.
Thank you. Finally, can I ask the committee to agree that a delegate authority to me, the Chair, in consultation with party group lead members and Caroline Pigeon AM MBE, to agree any output from today's discussion?
Agreed.
On item 4, this is just to date of next meetings to confirm the meeting of the committee is scheduled to take place on the 21st of July 2020. There may well be circumstances that there might well be a further emergency meeting. We try and give as much notice as possible, not just to yourselves, but also to the members of the public, who I urge them to monitor both the GLA website, both from the mayor's items that he may be posting on that website, but also for London Assembly work plans and future scrutiny meetings, not just held by ourselves at Oversight, but in terms of other committees of the London Assembly. Moving on to item 5, I have no any other business that I consider urgent. I now declare this meeting closed. Thank you very much for your participation.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair.
GLA Chamber Sound.